the packaged food industry is the supervillain of the century, especially when it comes to sugar. Even in, a quote unquote healthy grocery store like Whole Foods, it's still 80% of the grocery store that has added sugar. And yes, we're counting honey, we're counting maple syrup, because once it gets to your bloodstream, as I described, your body doesn't care if it was from a natural source or not. It's chemistry. Blood sugar is our glucose metabolism. So glucose is the simplest form of energy that we use in our body. We need it to live. If we were to remove all carbohydrates from our diet, which includes glucose, we would have a very we would not be setting out for greatness. We would probably die. The issues arise when we have too much of a good thing all at once, when we have too much glucose entering our bloodstream and our body can't use up the energy fast enough, so our body stores it for later, oftentimes as fat.
Welcome back to the Medicin podcast. My name is Mimi, and I am sitting next to my love, my partner in life, and really everything.
What is going on, everybody? This is Chase. And if you've been listening to the Medicin for a while, you may be familiar with our guest today. But if you're relatively new, in the last even year or two, I think it might have been a few years ago that we had this very special guest that we have the honor of bringing back on the Medicin. Welcome back, Phoebe Lapine.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited for today's conversation.
Yeah, it's going to be a good one. I'm excited. You have a book out now called Carbivore, which I have been devouring. It's so good. It's like educational, but also cookbook, which I absolutely love. And you guys, when I opened this book, I was thumbing through the recipes and I saw this Moroccan chicken dish and I was like, I need to make this immediately. And so the next night I made it for Chase and I, and it was so
really good. Oh my God.
Huge dish. And we just picked off of it for like 3 days. And it was an absolute, it was just so flavorful. If you guys grab her book, definitely put that on your list of things to make ASAP. I digress a little bit, but we are so happy to have you on and talking about this very important topic, one that we have not really had a full episode on. So I'm really excited for you to share your wisdom and your experience with our listeners. I thought we could start by, I mentioned the name of your book is Carbivore. It sounds sort of familiar, right? Like we've heard these terms, carnivore, omnivore, but to start, how would you define the term carbivore? And did you coin it?
I mean, I think I coined it. I'm not sure.
Well done.
Google keeps auto-correcting to carnivore, as does Amazon. So that was like an unforeseen consequence. My editor, who's like very positive, is like, well, that just means we're doing something that's never been done before. Yeah. I'm like, okay, or that no one can find the book, but cool. But yes, I always start my books with kind of a list of essential terms. And this one, I was like, let's all get on the same page and let's define the made up terms too. So I defined carbivore, let's see if I can pull it from memory, as someone who embraces carbs as part of a healthy diet, but make sure that they don't cause chaos in the body.
Yeah.
And so, the first 50 pages is all about strategies for doing that. I have coined the term slow carb, which I hope we can all make a thing.
Yeah.
The new low carb diet, we're just going slow carb instead. But yes, it's all about kind of how to balance your metabolic health with your gut health, and then how to balance that with actual pleasure. Because I feel like that's not something that's discussed enough in the health and wellness space, is, really dialing into your pleasure centers, which is so important for a healthy, happy life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. As we've been in the health and wellness space for some time and seen all sorts of different approaches and techniques and protocols, and early on, I came across, I won't say her name, I'm not trying to call her out, but a woman who teaches a lot of people. And her main technique was just to remove any pleasure that you might have with your food. And then you won't be tempted to overeat, right? If you're not eating food that is like super pleasurable, super palatable, then you just, it won't be a problem for you. And she was teaching this technique to probably millions of people of
Oh
how
my
big she was. And I
gosh.
was just like, I respected her work in so many other ways, but I was like, I cannot get on board with this. I just firmly believe that like food is supposed to give us pleasure in some
Yeah.
way, shape, or form. It's just if you remove all the pleasure that you get from food from your life, I don't know. I could not get on board with this. So I love that
Yeah.
you're marrying the two, like health and pleasure coming together in a way that doesn't cause chaos in the body, which I think is a perfect definition.
And it's really interesting too, because when I finished the manuscript, Ozempic and that class of drugs were not kind of the big headline that they are today. I mean, it's really been in the last year or so
Right.
that they've
Yeah.
just surged. And so, I mean, it would have been interesting to write a bit about that in the book, but there's a great op-ed, I can't remember where it was, that I read a little while ago that was talking about kind of how the drugs work on our pleasure centers, and that so many people, you know, report that it has such an amazing halo effect of curing all sorts of addictions, but that in quieting the food noise, like you're really just like living a life of gray. And this
Right.
writer, I can't remember her name, she was like, why are we calling it food noise? We should be calling it food music. Like it is such a source of pleasure in our life. And I always say, because obviously, you know, there are two sides of the spectrum. There's kind of extreme Western medicine that doesn't really talk enough about diet. But then I think, you know, sometimes we go a little bit far in the other direction where like we see food as just medicine. And I think food is medicine, but I do not think it is just medicine. It is also culture. It's how we show love. It's, you know, a big part of our social wellness.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. And not talked about enough in the health era that I matured through. In my 20s, it was kind of the onslaught of podcasting and the alternative health space that had, of course, just incredible information that I was able to, you know, not be formally educated in health and well-being at all. Nothing of the sciences. I'm a, you know, freaking CPA. But I was able to, like, you know, essentially DIY myself through podcasting and books and others, this route to being healthy. That being said, a lot of mistakes along the way and a lot of extreme dieting along the way. And this era of demonizing carbohydrates, you know, keto, carnivore, you know, intermittent fasting, and some of these other protocols that are pretty extreme at times have been insightful, but ultimately have some negative byproducts to them when adopted through someone who's trying to DIY it like myself. And so very relevant conversation today. I'm excited to reintegrate the positives of what a slow carb lifestyle can look like.
Yeah, great.
So I want to update our listeners. I know you shared a little bit about your story the first time you were on, but share a bit about your journey with Hashimoto's and SIBO, and you share in the book some skin irritation, some skin problems that you had. What were you experiencing? And then also, what were your doctors telling you, and what has actually worked for you long term?
Oh my gosh. I could talk about this for a long time, but I won't. I'll give you the Cliff's Notes. So I quit my corporate job when I was around 22 to pursue a career as a chef and food writer. And around the exact same time was diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And so it was just an interesting first part of my career and I always explain, you know, the real food background, because I think that is why I am an evangelist for pleasure and for food as pleasure. Because I came to the health stuff really begrudgingly, really not wanting to be an omnivore. So my first doctor was just like, you know, it's not a big deal. It's very common. Here's this medicine. You'll be on it for the rest of your life. And I was like, what? And I didn't go on the medicine. I didn't do anything. I wore myself down to like real rock bottom, then kind of found the integrative path back up, but also had some practitioners who were, again, kind of pretty extreme, did a bunch of elimination diets, which were ultimately helpful, discovered gluten and I just don't get along. So I've been gluten-free for, 12, 13 years, since before it was really a thing, before you could really find a lot of options on shelves.
Sure.
But one of those practitioners was like a really extreme endocrinologist, and she truly made me feel like I had to throw out the entire contents of my apartment and like replace them with baking soda and like organic cotton. And it was just really overwhelming. And that's kind of what led me to start writing more about my experience and about finding the middle ground, what I have coined as healthy hedonism. So I wrote about that in my book 2 books ago called The Wellness Project. And then basically off the back of that real life experiment, which was successful for my thyroid journey, I then dealt with something called SIBO. And again, I was very grateful and very lucky to have different integrated doctor at this point, but a doctor who kind of diagnosed me right away because SIBO, Hashimoto's, a lot of these things just go undiagnosed for so long. I, on the other hand, was diagnosed and just ignored the diagnosis. But SIBO, I was more mature and I hopped on board right away and really just found a lack of resources. And so that's when I started my own podcast called SIBO Made Simple and wrote my last book that we talked about on our last episode. But SIBO really opened my eyes to kind of the nuances of gut health and how different a plan can be for someone experiencing an acute issue like IBS or SIBO from, the kind of more general, wishy-washy, like quote unquote gut health advice we hear about in the wellness zeitgeist that is, it's probably aspirational for a lot of people, but doesn't necessarily meet everyone where they're at.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so your doctors basically gave you medication. They gave you probably, I would guess with SIBO, like most of what I hear from people is like very blanket generalized statements like, oh yeah, there's some inflammation or there's some dysregulation going on and we don't know what it is. Did anything that they tell you help at all?
Yeah, no, my doctor for SIBO was great. I think it's just, there's only so many tools that they can give you. Yeah. He put me on an herbal protocol, which is, pretty similar efficacy wise to some of the antibiotic options. And he told me to go on a low FODMAP diet, which for those who aren't familiar is super restrictive around certain types of carbohydrates. So it's actually interesting as it dovetails with our conversation today. And then, he gave me a laundry list of supplements. But I think it was more, once I did the treatment, I was lucky. I cured, quote unquote, my SIBO the first round of treatment. But then I think what no one really prepares you for is that there's this long runway of healing. And like, that's the huge part of the battle. That's the real crux of it all. And, I get a lot of people asking me questions about SIBO again, because I don't know, I've become like a de facto expert and there aren't that many of us out there, but people who are just really in the weeds with treatment and with their symptoms and are like, when am I going to start feeling better? Is the SIBO back? And that's the thing is that sometimes treatments can create more symptoms, can create more damage in some ways. And so I think you always need, again, an extra runway to heal from the treatment and from, whatever the grand amount of damage that was being done, maybe unwittingly for a long time.
Yeah, I think there's probably a few people listening right now that are currently dealing with SIBO. And if that is you, I would highly recommend going back to our previous episode with Phoebe and listening to that because we go deep into SIBO and your journey and how you healed and what you recommend for other people and your first book. But yeah, I think that there's so many of us that come to integrative health or functional medicine because we feel let down in some way, shape, or form by our just, medical providers. And it can definitely swing the other way where you're on one end of the spectrum and then you swing all the way to the other. And they have similarities on opposite ends of the spectrum. And I think a main theme that we're going to talk about today is like the middle way in this area of life, but then also like almost every other area of life, not too much, not too little. We talk about this all the time on the podcast. So, I would love to start on one end of the spectrum today. So, let's talk about the problems that plague most I would say a large majority of Americans who maybe aren't super knowledgeable with how food, how sugar, how processed carbohydrates really affect them long term. So I really want our audience to understand like the physiology of, I know you're not a biologist, but you've researched and written a lot about this. I want our listeners to know, to really understand the physiology of what's going on internally when we get a flood of processed carbohydrates or naked carbs or just a vat of sugar essentially into our bloodstream. Like, what's happening inside of us, and how does that contribute long term to chronic illness?
Absolutely. So blood sugar is our glucose metabolism. So glucose is the simplest form of energy that we use in our body. We need it to live. If we were to remove all carbohydrates from our diet, which includes glucose, we would have a very, we would not be setting out for greatness. We would probably die. It's the building block of all plants and whatnot. So when we're talking about, kind of stabilizing our blood sugar, we're not talking about, eliminating the sugar completely. So what happens is just the issues arise when we have too much of a good thing all at once, when we have too much glucose entering our bloodstream and our body can't use up the energy fast enough. So our body stores it for later, oftentimes as fat. So the visual I like to give people is if we are having quote unquote processed sugar, and that could be natural or otherwise. I like to give the example of apple juice. So apple juice is processed. Sorry, it's not the whole apple. Very different. So when we remove all the fiber from that apple and we drink it on an empty stomach, our intestinal wall is kind of similar to a fine mesh sieve. So that apple juice is just going to pour through like a waterfall. It can reach our bloodstream within 5 minutes. So that is quite fast. And that's because there's nothing else in the tank to slow it down. So if you were to have that apple the way nature intended it, with skin and seeds, well, I don't know who eats their apple seeds, but I mean, it would probably be better for you. It's got more fiber, but with all the fiber intact, once that fiber reaches your intestinal wall, it's going to act very similarly as if you were to muddle that apple through a fine mesh sieve. You're going to get this kind of fibrous sludge there that even if you were to drink the apple juice directly after, it would take a bit longer for it to enter your bloodstream. It would be more like a drip, drip, drip versus an unobstructed waterfall. So that's how, we kind of need to think about, what we're putting in our body. And you don't have to get too granular and too obsessive about it. But the ways that, the packaged food industry has changed our eating habits is taking our macronutrients and just jumbling them up completely. And the process really, took a turn for the worse in the 90s with the low fat movement.
Yeah.
The Snackwell's cookies of my childhood and all of the cereals and whatnot. Because when we remove the fat from things, we're removing one of the main macronutrients that, again, helps to slow down the absorption of sugars into our bloodstream. So fat and protein in particular kind of slow down gastric emptying. So it means whatever's going on in our stomach will take longer to reach the small intestines where our glucose is absorbed, again, through the intestinal wall. But fiber has its own superpower, as I mentioned, which is that, that sludge, that protective layer to slow things down even further. But all of them, act in tandem. I say it's an ensemble cast. And what happens when we remove, one of those star players, like the example I like to give is in fat-free yogurt. People don't normally think of yogurt as a very high carb, dish, but lactose is a sugar. So when you take out something that was making up the bulk of, the mass of a dish, then you're going to get more sugar. And even if it's not, it's not fructose, so the kind that's, directly metabolized by your liver that can give us a lot more problems, it's still going to mean, again, a little bit too much of a good thing all at once.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great explanation, and I love the examples, the sort of metaphors that you that you include in the book to explain that. And so if somebody is doing this over time, and probably most people just we don't know what we don't know. We don't know that drinking apple juice is not actually helping us. It's probably more deleterious to our health than additive. But what happens over time, or if somebody was to do these things over time, how does that contribute to things like chronic illness? And chronic illness, I know, is a very big, broad, vague term, but it's not just obesity that we have to worry about, oh, just, putting on the pounds. There are so many other things that can happen as a result of this onslaught of sugar. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, it can be a really slippery slope. And it kind of all boils down to your two main workhorses, your digestive workhorses, your liver and your pancreas. So your liver has, by the way, a million different jobs, a lot of chores. I call it the Cinderella of your digestive system with not enough mice interns. Yeah. We need to get the liver some mice interns. But it's your liver's job to metabolize fructose and basically all of our hormones, and to make sure that you're storing that excess energy as fat or another, our body's other fun little container size storage containers for energy for later. And so it's constantly kind of flip-flopping back and forth. If we're flooding it with energy, it's doing that conversion. And then if we don't have enough energy, if we end up kind of on the other end of a dip in blood sugar, it's having to, take things out of storage and reintroduce them to the body. So this would all, be fine and dandy, although it probably wouldn't be, because your liver would still be overworked. But we need our pancreas to actually give the sign to the liver and tell him, kind of manage the liver and tell them when it's time to store things for later and to release again. And that is what insulin does. Insulin is essentially, the cue cards for liver to step in and do its job. And when these two organs are overworked, you can lose communication entirely between coworkers. You become insulin resistant, where our cells just stop even responding to the signal of insulin. And that's kind of the cornerstone of a lot of different conditions, PCOS for women, of course, diabetes. And then the result of just all of these breakdowns of communication is that our blood sugar just keeps rising with nothing to bring it down anymore. And that is where, the kind of blanket term of inflammation and oxidative stress on our cells come into play. So, there's so many ways that you can tie metabolic health and blood sugar to autoimmune disease, to all of these kind of modern illnesses. But the main thing to keep in mind is that insulin is a hormone. And again, our liver also is kind of in charge of, metabolizing a lot of hormones. So especially for women, like, things can really go off the rails if any of our levels are kind of skewed in a way that they're not supposed to be. Everything just, unfortunately, is quite finely calibrated. So again, yeah, it is really the cornerstone of our digestive health and the cornerstone of, so much of our overall health.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. Yeah, that's beautifully articulated. I think for anyone probably going back to like growing up in the 80s and 90s, early 2000s, even before there was this move towards like clean eating and like this education around too much sugar, you're finally even starting to see it in mainstream headlines. Like, we've got a sugar problem. We've got a culture that's addicted to sugar, which is arguably worse than cocaine in many ways. But we grew up in the 90s, and it was pretty clear to see that if you had Cocoa Puffs for breakfast and you had, microwavable pizza from Costco at lunch and then Hamburger Helper for dinner, it was pretty clear, like, bad. Didn't know why. We just knew that was bad. So the attempt at being healthy based on just shopping through normal grocery stores is, well, I'm going to do Honey Bunches of Oats. That's a healthy cereal.
Raisin Bran.
Right. Or I think it's Honey Nut Cheerios that's like, it's heart healthy. That's some sort of like campaign. And then, maybe lunch, it's like, well, I've got my fruit by the foot. It's made with real fruit in my lunch sack, and my white bread with single cheese and some protein.
One piece of turkey.
Piece of turkey as the protein. I mean, I look back and see and even if, like, my mom, thank God, cooked a very well balanced whole food dinner a lot of times, but I'd still chug 16 ounces of orange juice before I'd go to bed, and have an ice cream snack before I go to bed. And so I look back on my childhood, which I believe to have been intended to be pretty healthy considering what was available. But
orange juice, I mean, so good for you. So much vitamin C.
Right, yeah. I'm just blasted with sugar, probably like 50 grams of protein for a growing boy, right? And I'm like, oh my God.
It's a good thing that you were an athlete and played hours a day.
But like the point that I'm making.
Yeah, I mean, you were probably fine because you were, burning it off by moving those muscles.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. But like the point I'm making is like, even if we make our best attempt, we're still consuming sugar to such ridiculous degrees that we almost have to go above and beyond to try to avoid this type of sugar. And so maybe if you can speak to that, like, what is your sort of awareness been and the journey of sort of becoming aware? How has that looked as far as like taking inventory of the food that you're eating? And, maybe if you could just educate us and our audience on some general do's and don'ts as it pertains to like the grocery store at large.
Oh my God. And let me just say, like, I sympathize with everyone. It is an uphill battle. We are not set up to succeed. I mean, you said fruit by the foot and I started salivating.
Like, gushers, dude. Come on.
Yeah. I was a sucker for all the fruit leather and all of that.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes. So I think, unfortunately, the packaged food industry is the villain, the super villain of the century when it comes to this story, especially when it comes to sugar. Even in, a quote unquote healthy grocery store like Whole Foods, it's still 80% of the grocery store that has added sugar. And yes, we're counting honey, we're counting maple syrup, because once it gets to your bloodstream, as I described, your body doesn't care if it was from a natural source or not. It's chemistry. It's just going to be broken down, and your liver is going to deal with it. But I think, I think that the real issue is this topic of mindless sugar. So what you're just not aware of that you're eating on a regular basis. It's the foods that we have every single day that are kind of our staples that we just don't look at the back of the package and take inventory of. And I'm not saying that, if you have 1 gram of sugar in your mayonnaise, that is like, going to be causing huge issues for you. I think it's just the lack of awareness and the fact that so many things add up. And then I think the second part is that, these things aren't bringing us any conscious pleasure. So we are so hard on ourselves. We're so shame and guilt oriented when it comes to like real desserts and having them, but we're having, kind of barista blend almond milk that has like 7 grams of sugar in it without even knowing, because like we didn't look at the back of the package. And packages are super tricky. I mean, it's no one's fault for doing so. And especially now that, companies are wisening up and greenwashing their products, they could say natural on the front. They could say any number of claims to make you go, oh, that's a good option. So yeah, I think number one is just turn over the label, see the ingredient list, see what's listed, see how many types of sugar. It has really sneaky names sometimes. I have a whole list of added sugar cheat sheet terms in the book. And then look at actually the nutrition label, at how much fiber, how much protein is in there. Mostly the fiber to sugar ratio is the one that you want to look at. And anything that's kind of larger than a 1-to-5 ratio, which is roughly, what the sugar to fiber ratio is in a whole fruit, 1 gram of fiber to 5 grams of sugar, should just get a second look. Or you can just employ some of the tactics and strategies that I mentioned in the book when you eat those things, and know to combine them with other ingredients that will slow down the sugars, slow your carbs roll to your bloodstream. But I think it's, there's so many brands that, are not, that I'm not personally brand loyal to. I've slowly changed out some of my, my almond butter, my pasta sauce, my almond milk, lots of little things. And I don't know. It's like, I'm not really experiencing any sort of deficit as a result of doing that. And I personally am of the mind that it's better to set yourself up for success at home so you can find more flexibility out in the world. So that's my general motto and my general mantra is like really just try and ask the question of yourself of whether you are attached to certain ingredients, certain brands. And if you are, great, keep them. And if not, then, there probably are better options out there. And, everyone's on a different budget. Everyone has different constraints in terms of where they shop. So it's just about being a little bit more conscious about the things we're eating every day.
Really, really good. Yeah. I'd love for you to talk about the addictive qualities of sugar, and how much you've looked into some of that research. And then I will just share quickly for myself. I feel as if the most addicted to a substance I've ever been in my life has been sugar.
Yeah.
I was unable to complete a day without crushing a bowl of Golden Grams. And I'm dead serious. It would cause me to act crazy. And I lived my life very, very dialed in, like exercise enthusiast. I was fasting. I was virtually, ketogenic outside of these.
You were like 5% body fat.
Right. But there would be these, I would have, endurance athlete type activities, and I would do my little math on calories in, calories out, knowing that pre and post workout, I could fuel myself with kind of like cheap carbohydrates for a form of transactional energy. But the lifestyle, behavioral, mental, emotional, hormonal impact, I believe, of having these sugar spikes. I mean, I would sometimes have multiple bowls of Golden Grams, cause for such an addictive pattern in my life that I would be moods, I'd have mood swings. I would be very grumpy without it. I'd go on a trip and be like, damn, it's been a day since I've had a sugar hit of some kind. I'd need to make a grocery store run. And you wouldn't have guessed that this was, because of the way that I looked. But I have, since heard some of this research around like, mice will prefer sugar over cocaine when provided in these various experiments. And so for me, when I hear that, I'm like, you know what? That is a full-blown addictive drug, like an addictive substance. And I'd be curious your thoughts, because it, for me, took a cold turkey cutting of sugar altogether for a period of time. And it's been freedom on the other side of it. But I don't know if I would have been able to get through it by just like tapering down.
Yeah. So I actually went through this experiment at the very beginning of my wellness project. I gave up sugar, caffeine, and alcohol for 30 days. And I was definitely going from, more of a standard diet. And I had given up caffeine before, so I kind of was aware of what that withdrawal kind of felt like, the mild headaches and whatnot. And so I felt like I could really zero in on the fact that like 4 or 5 days later, I was having serious sugar withdrawal. So I feel you. It is an absolute dopamine hit that hijacks our brain, because we are, conditioned as a species to want to have as much readily available energy as possible. I mean, again, like we need glucose to live. And when we had to forage for our food and couldn't just go to Whole Foods to fill up our cart with a million things with sugar in them, it was a scarce resource that we had, a biological incentive to try and find. And that is like what fructose is essentially. So fructose is fruit sugar, glucose, is the building blocks of both fructose and sucrose and starch. But yeah, in terms of going cold turkey and weaning off, it is one of the areas where finding moderation is really tricky, because again, we're just programmed to want more. I think that what I've found is to rely on my taste buds more than anything, because our taste buds can be reprogrammed. And over the course of 2 weeks, you can really fundamentally change at least the pleasure element of things. I personally cannot eat certain sweets, certain baked goods, because they are just too sweet for me now. Most of the baked goods in Carbivore, and there are desserts in there, I can usually get away with cutting the sugar from like a standard recipe in half by 50% and still enjoying it. And it's still being delicious. And other people I've served it to, still enjoying it too. So yeah, there is part of the weaning that you can find ways to just like cut back on the quantity, which is half the battle for most people. But it is a slippery slope when it comes to cravings. And that's where all these other strategies, I think, really come into play, and where it's so important to not be eating sugar on an empty stomach and snacking on sugar and starting your day with sugar for breakfast, and instead just focusing those sugar brownie points on like an actual brownie that you eat for dessert.
Really good. Really good. Yeah. I want to come back to the middle way and how we can do this with moderation. Maybe if we move into kind of what the zig to the world's zag with sugar has looked like, especially, in the last 10 to 15 years or so with this movement into keto and this complete cutout of sugar altogether, or carbohydrates. It's not even just sugar. It's like the full-blown demonization of carbohydrates. And so maybe if you could talk a little bit about, how you've seen that shift, and then maybe some of the, negatives or things that people should look out for when shifting into more of an extreme no-carb life.
Yeah. So I mentioned the low FODMAP diet earlier. I know you've been through, phases of various diets, but one thing I just wanted to point out is that these are therapeutic diets. Like, they are not meant to be a lifestyle. They are meant to be a short-term, like 2-month stint with medical or dietitian supervision to help you through it to, again, get you kind of onto a better plateau, whether it's for IBS, whether it's, for insulin sensitivity, what have you. I mean, keto is so extreme. You are literally burning fat for fuel from within. And the issue with that, especially for women, and I'm not a practitioner, so I only can I don't have my even clinical data to tell you about. I just have my anecdotal data from, talking about health on the internet to a lot of people. But especially for women, I know so many women who have really had adverse reactions to keto. And I think one of the reasons is that we need carbs. We need carbohydrates to produce certain hormones. And I'm a thyroid girly, specifically thyroid hormones. And the funny thing about, a lot of people with Hashimoto's or with hypothyroidism is that, the impact is extreme fatigue and sluggishness and weight gain. But if we take on too extreme a reaction to that, go keto for too long, or, intermittent fast for too long, anything that kind of says to a woman's body that, you're in a state of starvation, it can actually make matters worse, because you're not going to have, your basic fuel for those thyroid hormones. And then it's kind of just becomes another little vicious cycle. I got a little bit off topic, but yeah.
No, it's perfect.
Great.
Yeah. So I think, the demonization of carbs, again, it kind of comes from a good place, in that we do have an obesity epidemic. We do have an epidemic of diabetes. We do have an epidemic with autoimmune disease. But yeah, the extreme approaches were never meant to kind of reach a mass audience, I don't think. They were really just meant for medical practices. And the same goes for a low FODMAP diet. So a low FODMAP diet takes out certain types of carbohydrates that are in a lot of healthy fruits and vegetables, but that people with IBS can really struggle with. That can be irritating for them oftentimes because they have an issue like SIBO. But there's been such great data behind it that a lot of doctors are like, here's this diet that will help your symptoms. And people go on it and they're like, oh, I feel so much better. But then there's no off ramp. There's no one teaching them how to get off of it and how to moderate going forward. So I think that's where, you talked about not having, the support when you were trying on and DIYing things. Like, you're not alone. Even people who are seeing practitioners like I did for my SIBO, I don't know that I really had the proper roadmap for how to reintegrate and diversify my diet again. And I think, that's where the science really, we can generalize, is that one of the most important things that we can do for our overall health, that we could do especially for our gut health, is have diversity in our diet. And when we start eliminating completely certain macronutrients, that's just going to restrict. It's just going to make that diversity go down even further in practice.
Yeah.
So good. A couple comments from me. Just in my years of having been in a very, very low carbohydrate state year round, all year, never stop. I kicked my sugar addiction through the process of learning keto. And like you said, almost as if it was a therapeutic modality for 30 or 60 days. I'm grateful for what I've learned as far as how my body is able to use fat as fuel. But I did this for multiple years at a time, intermittent fasting or even more extreme fasting protocols for years at a time. And from my experience, what I didn't know, and this is like, Dave Asprey's coming online at this time frame, and he's a huge name promoting the benefits of fat dominance in your diet. Again, lots of truth there. Mark Sisson, another one, founder of Primal Kitchen. He's made some incredibly low sugar or no sugar alternatives to dressings and sweeteners and everything like that. God bless him. And then these other, big names, Ben Greenfield and some of these others that are coming online. And this, it's great, right? Tom DeLauer, he's a massive YouTuber, promotes keto like crazy. And dude, keto feels amazing. When you break through that first couple weeks, it feels incredible. You're clean energy. You're super efficient. You're sleeping better. You're lean. You get super cut. And so from my seat, I was like, this is the best thing ever. What I didn't realize is that so many of the advocates, one, were highly intelligent, scientific-based experts that had every minute of their day tracked to perfection. Two, many of them were on anabolic exogenous steroids. And for a male who is a performance athlete, someone who really leans into exercise, to not be aware of the fact that these educators were using performance enhancing anabolics, which I have no shame with, I just prefer they mention that, compensates for some of the catabolic aspects of something like a very, very low carbohydrate diet. And so for a performance athlete, you are eventually going to run out of fuel. Like those fat stores, no matter what you do, your body's going to start begging for carbohydrates.
Well, when you're at 4, 5, 6% body fat, even, like, where is the fat coming from? That's burning for fuel.
Right.
And
all these guys talk now about carb refuel days and carb cycling and some of these other things that would have been very helpful at 27 when I had a full blown hormone shutdown.
Yeah.
Oh my God, you poor thing.
Just to give a little context for everybody listening, what these protocols suggest, and I haven't done carnivore, but it's essentially a ketogenic diet in a lot of ways. And I know there's modifications where you use honey and berries and things of that nature. But in the keto protocols that I was abiding by, there were, basically less than 10% of your calories as carbs. And in some cases, no direct carbohydrate, no food that would be considered a carb dominant food whatsoever. And so you could be under 30 grams of net carbohydrates a day to be in this realm, which means a handful of berries. That's about it. Sometimes even less. And again, there are some benefits. And I love the way that you said that. I'm going to be using that often, is these are therapeutic modalities that should have a lifespan on them, or a hand-holding process with someone who is very aware of the biofeedback they should be looking for signs of detriment.
Used like a prescription.
Right. So all that to give context as to, firsthand experience of some of the benefits, surely. I'm grateful that I kicked sugar and have had no issues since then. That being said, it also led me down a path into high stress, high catabolic, and what ultimately led is adrenal exhaustion.
And I had a similar journey, which I've shared on the podcast many times, so our listeners are aware, but just validating what you said exactly, where I was intermittent fasting specifically for over a year. I did this where I wouldn't eat till I would have my coffee on an empty stomach, my fat coffee, and then I wouldn't eat till 1 p.m. And I did that for over a year, and come to find out, I got really lean, but my thyroid was trashed, and I was basically making zero estrogen. So just to validate exactly what you're saying, that was exactly my experience. And
you are not alone.
I'm not alone, but it's because I was listening to these different health podcasts like Ben Greenfield, and no shade against Ben
Greenfield. So much love for these people, right?
he's a pioneer, of course, but he's a 35-year-old endurance elite athlete,
Exactly.
not a
Yeah.
28-year-old fertile female or trying to be fertile, you know? And so it was a nightmare for me to again, like figure out I thought this was healthy. I thought I was trying to be healthy. And so to claw your way out of that hormone health hellhole, usually DIY, for us it was DIY. Man, it is so hard. So again, just coming back full circle to your work and the book that you just wrote and came out with that just dropped this week is sitting right here. I am so grateful for this information because this really is the middle way. It's not demonizing anything. It's not demonizing food groups. It's enjoying and engaging in these food groups intelligently. And so let's jump into some of these techniques and tips that you give in the book. I think would be really great for our listeners to hear, and maybe like, your top 3 to 4 that you are an absolute must for you in your life, and then people that you speak to and work with.
Absolutely. And what I'll say, first of all, just to piggyback off of both of your stories, is that everyone has a different carb tolerance. I mean,
Sure.
That's kind of the issue with biohacking, is ironically, like, it should be completely individual because we are all bio-individual. But when we're consuming it, through the lens of one person's experience, we end up just kind of like boilerplating their model onto ourselves, and it just doesn't work. I mean, especially men versus women, if you both wear a continuous glucose monitor and eat the exact same thing, you're going to notice totally different impacts. Like if I eat a piece of cake after dinner versus my husband, sometimes that'll spike me, it won't spike him. But in general, I'll also say, because it's becoming a little bit more like trendy to talk about glucose spikes in the wellness world. And I just want to point out to people that, kind of flattening the curve completely is not necessarily the goal. Every time we eat, our blood sugar goes up. By the way, also, if you work out on an empty stomach and do not have any glucose in your bloodstream that you can quickly use, again, your liver is going to convert something from your body into energy, and you will see a spike. Will see a spike, which, there's kind of debate about whether or not that is like a healthy spike or not. But it's all to say that, there is going to naturally be some volatility. So I don't want anyone to get in the biohacking mindset of like, oh my God, I can't have like any sort of reactivity to food. So actually that's a good lead into one of my tips that I feel like isn't talked about enough in the, in kind of the blood sugar space. And that is meal spacing. And it's something that I was very passionate about in, my SIBO journey. But again, if you're thinking about just regulating the volatility, just not going constantly up and down, even if you're eating like a keto friendly snack, like a handful of almonds, you're still going to have your blood sugar go up. Like, it's just the nature of the beast. You're adding fuel to the car. We get glucose through food. That's our primary method of energy. So if you're snacking all the time, you're just going to experience like a little bit of that volatility. And again, force your digestive organs to kind of be constantly putting down their other chores and hopping in to help you. And then the second thing that I think is really important to note is that we have this mechanism called the migrating motor complex, which I can't remember our last conversation, but I'm sure I talked about it. Because I'm talking about it. Yeah. So this is this nerve wave system that essentially cleans after a meal. So if you picture all of that fibrous sludge just lining your small intestines, they're a windy, craggy, organ. So the main way that we make sure that we don't have, that fiber building up and feeding our bacteria and, maybe enticing them to stick around instead of moving along to our large intestines is this nerve wave that just like kind of sweeps through the debris after a meal. But the thing with the MMC is that it only kicks in during a fasting state of 90 minutes or more. Truly, our bodies were not designed to snack all the time. I know, everyone, again, I'm all for bioindividuality. If you're someone who needs a lot of really smart meals. All I'm saying is that is not really the way we were designed to live. So, if there's one way that you want to kind of reduce volatility on a macro scale, it's just trying to have bigger meals and space them out and give your body time in between to metabolize them. And then the other part of that is that just so many snacks these days are not blood sugar keto friendly snacks. They're full of added sugar and generally packaged. So you'll kind of be getting out of the hamster wheel of those conveniences if you can just learn to build your meals in a way that will actually carry you to the next one and not make you, bogged down with hunger cravings in between.
Mm-hmm. And not only our meals, but also what we're consuming in the form of drinks, right?
Yes. I think beverages are a huge loophole for people. Juices especially. I mean, unless you're going and getting a custom green juice that you're, only selecting greens for. I mean, the majority of packaged green juices have like 35 grams of sugar, the same amount as a Coca-Cola or a soda. I mean, I went through Whole Foods and I picked up quote unquote healthy foods and I turned around the label. I did a little video for people on my feed and people were just like shook.
Wow.
And again, it's just, we don't always think to like turn the green juice around. We think that is a healthy option. Oh, I'm going to make the smart choice. I'm going to get the green juice. I'm going to get the coconut water. I'm going to get the kombucha. And I would say that by and large, I will always advocate eating sugar instead of drinking sugar if you have the choice, because when we drink sugar, we're just going to consume it so much faster. You can drink, that 35 grams of sugar in the green juice in like 2 minutes tops, maybe 30 seconds. You can chug it. And then sometimes we do that on an empty stomach, which just makes things worse. So I'm not saying, if you love some of these things, just think of them as a treat, have them at the end of the meal, and not as, a snack or, on an empty stomach as breakfast or whatnot. And then the other part of that is, the common sense of it all is that if you slow down your eating, you will naturally slow down the rush of glucose to your bloodstream.
Yeah.
So there's some other, tips that specifically, like, again, relying on fiber, eating fiber before your carbs, adding carb companions, which is what I call just anything with fat, healthy fat, protein, or fiber, like nuts and seeds are among my favorite carb companions. There are some of my non-carb recipes in the book are for these delicious sprinkles that you can just keep in your pantry and add to your pasta or your salads or what have you. But I think slowing down in general, mindful eating, it sounds so wishy-washy to people. I don't know, like you can't get behind it in the same way as some of these like biohacker tips, but it really does have a huge impact. When we're caught in fight and flight and not in rest and digest mode, our cortisol is elevated. And guess what else is elevated? Our blood sugar. Because when we were in the wild, that rise in cortisol usually meant danger. It meant probably we were going to have to exert ourselves to get away from like a tiger or whatnot, some sort of big cat. And what does that require? Anytime we're doing physical activity, it requires quick energy. So oftentimes, when we're in that state, it means that our blood sugar is going to be humming at a higher level, and anything we eat in that state is going to cause more volatility, even if it's not necessarily quote unquote high carb.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And you mentioned a few tips here that I just want to highlight for the listener. You mentioned eating fiber first. You mentioned chewing your food and slowing down, just the act of like slowing the process down.
Yeah.
Because I grabbed Chase's shoulder with this because it's something that we talk about frequently.
Just shovel food.
We sit at the dinner table
My
for a
husband
long
does too.
time. Yeah. We sit at the dinner table for a long time. We talk, we converse, we laugh, whatever. So it's great. It's like this ceremony and we're, humming together beforehand to make sure that we're like in a parasympathetic mode. But sometimes it's like 5 minutes and the food is gone.
Vacuum.
And so I frequently we're trying to do better, reminding each other like, let's chew. And sometimes we're talking a lot. And so you're like, Okay, now I can say what I wanted to say, and you're getting it down really quickly. So we need to like have a meal where we don't talk at all. We just focus on our food. We smile at each other.
I
I'm
need
gonna
like a
try as an
I need
experiment.
like a shot clock, you know?
Yeah,
Whatever, like, okay,
yeah.
30 seconds is up. I can
Just
swallow my food now.
chew.
And all of these things, by the way, they're all just part of a toolkit. You
Yeah,
don't have
sure.
to apply all of them in your life all at once. And
Right.
if there are any that just are not realistic for you and just don't serve you,
Yeah.
we can find something else to kind of take their place.
I love
That's what
that.
I think is amazing. Yeah, there's just a lot of strategies that once you learn more about, how your blood sugar actually works and also your digestion. And the reason why I brought up the chewing and the eating speed and also, the parasympathetic relationship to everything is that one of the biggest, blanket long-term goals that you can have to improve your carb tolerance is to feed your microbiome. Like your microbiome, your digestive system, is hugely predictive of how well you're going to moderate all of these other things. There's been tons of studies that look at the microbiomes of people with diabetes and obesity, and it's hard to prove causation, but there's like a super compelling correlation with some sort of diversity issue specifically with our microbiome. So I think that's also why it's important not to get too again, bogged down with the biohacking and the continuous glucose monitors, because they'll tell you that, a piece of cheese or a meat stick is going to be better for your blood sugar, but those things are not going to feed your microbiome. Even though a whole apple has fructose in it, it is going to be so much healthier for your body as a whole, even if you see a little bit more of a spike on your monitor.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting because we focus on a lot of whole foods ourselves. We don't eat a ton of like packaged, stuff.
Yeah.
Here and there. We don't demonize it. It's just we've gotten to this place where we truly crave whole foods, like whole nutritious foods. It's not like oh, poor you're living a muted life because you only eat whole foods. It's like, this is what my body craves. But when you speak about feeding your microbiome and that a meat stick or a piece of cheese isn't going to do that, the alternative being an apple or, fruits and vegetables. What else would you add to that is feeding our microbiome in a really healthy way?
Whole grains, potatoes, sweet, but carbs are actually, nutritious for our good gut critters. It'll be a little bit different to have a whole potato with the skin on, which is where the majority of the fiber in a potato is, versus, a processed like rice noodle or pasta that was made, in an industrial factory. But even pasta, if we look at the way Italians have traditionally artisanally made pasta over the years, pasta is incredibly healthy. And, some of the reasons why we don't digest it as well in this country and we see the blood sugar impact is simply because of how it's made and how it's cooked. So some tips specifically for that, and I'll just dive in a little bit deeper to that. So I did a video the other day that seemed to be pretty popular about why some people can go to Europe and, or Italy and have a bowl of pasta and not have issues with the gluten impact or maybe the blood sugar, whatever is, causing any sort of bloating or discomfort. And I think a lot of people think, oh, it's because, the flour over there doesn't have as much gluten in it. And the funny irony is, like, when you drill down, it actually has more gluten because they're using semolina wheat, which is bred to be high protein, which, gluten's a protein. And that's because it's ideal for pasta making. It creates that chew and that durability, that flexibility. But what happens is, even though they're starting off with something that is higher gluten, they're using these ancient practices of drying the pasta slowly on racks for a long period of time. Whereas we use these industrial factories that basically like flash dries the pasta in the quickest possible method. And what happens, when you do that is the gluten constricts and kind of tightens up, and that just makes it naturally harder to digest. So even though there's more gluten because of the slow carb way that it was processed and produced,
Literally.
you end up with something that's easier to digest. And we see examples of this with carbs so often, especially with bread and the way we make bread. I mean, we've quickened the rise time so much that we just don't have the same practices with the gluten. And similarly with sourdough fermentation, which is the way that a lot of bread used to be produced, that sourdough is a bacterial process that will reduce the carb count in your loaf. It'll also reduce the gluten. It has a really slow rise time to help develop those proteins in a way that's going to be easier for you to digest and better for your blood sugar. Slow carb, baby.
Yeah, yeah. We're traveling to Greece and Italy in May, and I'm really interested because I have an inflammatory reaction to gluten as well, and so I'm pretty much 99% gluten free. So I'm really interested to enjoy some of the pasta and bread over there and see if I have any sort of different response
See
to
what
it.
happens. Yeah, and this is not, by the way, advice. If you're celiac, you don't.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's not
pasta.
celiac. It's just I have certain inflammatory hotspots in my body that flare up when I have gluten. But some of these other recommendations, these tips that you include in your book, and there's so many in the book, you guys. It's so wonderful, and she goes deep into each of them. But some of the other ones that caught my attention: don't peel your veggies. Very interesting.
That potato skin. Keep it on. Keep it on.
Yeah, and something like a cucumber, apple, peach. These things that some people peel. Leave it on.
And that's because of its, companionship, if you will, to
the fiber.
The fiber. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, and it makes total sense. Develop resistant starch.
Yes. So most carbs, actually, this trick works for. But if you cook your carbs and then cool them down, that's going to increase the percentage of resistant starch. So resistant starch actually acts like fiber in the body. It doesn't get broken down into glucose and absorbed into the bloodstream. It passes on to your large intestine and feeds your critters there. And that's essentially what fiber does. Fiber is a glucose molecule, but you cannot break it down, unlike starch. So it just, again, passes through your body, forms a nice little sludge, and moves on to feed your critters. So that's great. It means, again, none of that's going to be rushing to your bloodstream. So the more that we can increase resistant starch, it's twofold. It means less that's going to end up in our bloodstream and more food for our critters. So a double win. And when you cool down your carbs, even if you heat them back up, you're going to have that resistant starch. So I like to just keep that in the back of my mind, not as like something that I'm doing all the time and building into, my workflow. But if I'm eating leftovers, I feel really good about them.
Yeah,
right. You're meal prepping, you're cooking a bunch of rice or potatoes or whatever, and you keep it in the fridge. That's awesome. I love that trick. And that
overnight
works.
oats, stuff like that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've only ever considered that for, real starchy carbs like potatoes or rice or bananas or something. I don't even know if that still works for bananas, but you can use it with like grains and some of these other carbohydrates as well. Okay.
Oats, rice,
nice.
Pasta.
Okay.
Yeah, love that. You mentioned putting carbs at the bottom of your bowl.
I know that's like it's one that is like, it feels a little diet culture to me, but it's a good method, especially if you're prone to inhaling your food. Not naming names in this conversation.
I'll name my own name.
Yeah,
Fine.
But essentially you'll be shoveling through other things before you make it to the carbs. So I have two really delicious bowls in the book. I have a really simple poke bowl, and then I also have this Vietnamese style bowl with rice noodles. And both of them have tons of, I think actually both have cabbage, like a big slaw on top, and then some protein, fish in one, some steak in the other. And if you could just set yourself up for eating a few bites of the carb companions first before you make it to the carbs themselves, that'll be setting yourself up for success. And even more so if you start with a green salad or a kind of a larger serving of fiber first.
Yeah. On the note of salads, I think one of the Achilles heels of eating healthy is salad dressing, right? And so maybe talking a little bit about the pitfalls of just your standard salad dressing and what people can do as an alternative.
Yeah, so I have a whole chapter on carb companions, and I put my dressings and sauces in there because if you do not, lace them with sugar, there's usually, a lot of really good elements to them, especially if you can, I use a lot of tahini because it's ground sesame, delicious, healthy fats. But yeah, I think personally, and it's probably because I'm, a cook, chef, whatever you want to call it, but I find store-bought salad dressings to be like the least compelling packaged food. Like they are just never as good as what you will make in your kitchen. They're always loaded with sugar and stabilizers. And it's just really easy to make one of those sauces yourself and have them in the fridge. They last longer than a week. They last probably just as long, even without the stabilizers, as something that you're buying in a bottle. And you'll just always have it, at arm's reach, and be more compelled, I think, to make a salad as a result.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be complicated. Literally just lemon juice, olive oil, salt, pepper, garlic is amazing. Like,
yeah,
we make that all the time and just sprinkle it on. And this is something that I do. I try to do every single time we sit down to dinner. I might have a little bit of sauerkraut, or we might have a green salad, or I might have a raw carrot salad with some ACV on it and some salt. Whatever is green or vegetable or, going to be fibrous on my plate, I eat that first, which is one of your tips. Eat fiber first. So I might be tempted to dive into the, potato or sweet potato French fries or something like that first. My mind wants to go there because they're tasty.
Oh, mine does too. Yeah.
Yeah. But just like having the discipline to just like at least eat like 3/4 of the vegetables or the salad or whatever it is. And I always do that first and then kind of make the rounds and slowly go out from there. But it's such an easy thing to do.
Exactly. And it becomes habit. It becomes rote. You don't have to think about it too much.
Yeah. Yeah. And these things that really over time, it's a small action, but over time accumulated really do, it's like putting a penny away into that longevity bucket, into that long-term health bucket, where you're not going to just like feel it, in the moment when you do that. Right. But over time, it really is helpful to an overall healthy body.
Absolutely. And I'll just shout out quickly to like the IBS SIBO camp, because, fiber can be a very nuanced and, problematic subject for those people. And so I just want to say that, again, you can pick and choose some of these strategies. You don't have to be like eating a giant bowl of woody salad, before your main meal every time. There's like plenty of ways. There are plenty of its for this topic.
Yeah. Yeah. And you include a lot of them in the book. This has been so great. I think we could probably go on for another hour, but is there anything else in the book that we didn't cover that you feel like is really important to mention?
Yeah, I think when it comes to packaged foods, you can be deceived a little bit by the fiber number on the back of a package. And the reality is, unfortunately, if we're looking at chickpea pasta versus regular pasta, and you're like, oh, the chickpea pasta has so much more fiber. From a blood sugar standpoint, it is not going to make that big of a difference just because it's so processed. So, that fiber is completely, pulverized into microscopic bits. The same goes with like whole wheat bread versus white bread.
Interesting.
Again, you have to kind of retrain your definition of a processed food, and just remember that a whole almond is very different than almond meal, very different than almond milk. And ultimately, even though almond milk, I guess, has more fiber, and I'm sure that does have some benefit for your microbiome, but it's not going to be like a protective measure for your blood sugar. That's going to come from the literal whole foods. And the best strategy is just to eat whatever bread, whatever pasta you want, and then add whole foods to it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to ask about sweeteners. We're in the world of, supplements, and you are not, it's hard to find something that doesn't have at least monk fruit, stevia, if not sugar alcohols, erythritol, that are low sugar sweeteners. And some of them you can it doesn't really taste that great, so you may not look for them anyway, but some of them taste really good. What are your thoughts on alternative sweeteners, low sugar sweeteners, and how they interact with this sort of blood sugar relationship that we have?
Yeah, so the sugar alcohols can be tough for people with IBS. They're like in the FODMAP acronym. And I've always found, like, if there's something that's irritating me in a packaged food, like I'm feeling bloated, I'm like, and I usually write, it's usually a sugar alcohol. So I try and avoid those from a digestive standpoint. Stevia and monk fruit tend to be kind of the best blood sugar options. But in the book, I just use maple syrup and honey. Again, not because they're natural and they're better, but I think that they have incredible flavor. They kind of have added value with their stickiness sometimes. They can allow you to use a little bit less. And again, it's like I'm going to optimize for what I find the most delicious and then just reduce my quantity and change my strategy on how I'm eating those things.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I love that.
But I will say, because I think this maybe answers your question, and I won't name names, but there is a brand of sweets, of candies that, you know, claim they have like 3 grams of sugar and like 9 grams of fiber. And let me tell you, I ate them while wearing a continuous glucose monitor, and it was just like regular candy.
Yeah.
Because when your fiber's in a gummy bear, like, it's really not going to help you very much. And I think, you know, some of these sugar types of alternative sugars like still spike you. And then I think the last thing is that sugar again is like psychologically addictive, and so is like the taste of sweetness. You're kind of not doing your taste buds any favors with the weaning process by just like dumping a bunch of stevia into your bowl.
I agree.
Yeah, I try and get people, you know, I've done a lot of work with people in one of my coaching programs around giving up sugar. And I think there's a lot of emotional stuff that comes up for people. There's a lot of, it can be a real crutch. So I like people to really, you know, avoid those types of swaps and to just kind of sit with the discomfort and the learnings of it all. And then, just find other ways of moderating.
Yeah. I mean, the worst thing that's going to happen is you feel a feeling.
Yeah.
It's just usually like a feeling, you know, maybe a slight headache.
Hangry.
Maybe you get a little hangry, but it's like sometimes we run from like the anticipation of like, oh no, what is that going to be like? And usually the thing that we're running from is literally just a frequency. It's just a feeling in the body. We're not actually in any sort of danger or anything.
Right. Unless you're like severely under eating, which I've definitely been in periods of my life where I just needed calories flat out. Yeah. That being said, like a good question is like, am I hungry? And what does drinking this, you know, 8 to 12 ounce glass of water do after 5 minutes? Like, I wonder if that actually satiated me. I wonder what taking a deep breath through my belly does. And I actually remove myself from a stress state, and I get a little more grounded and you know, in a restful environment before I make the decision to reach for something that's loaded with sugar. I think those are really helpful.
I agree.
Yeah. Where can people find your book?
Hopefully wherever books are sold. But if you want links to purchase, go to carbivorecookbook.com. I'm also offering a free 2-week blood sugar boot camp course for those who purchase during launch month. Haven't decided when I'm taking that away, but go get it while the getting's good. And then you can find lots of free recipes and resources on my website, feedmephoebe.com.
Yeah, love that.
Awesome.
Of course, we will have all of those links in the show notes, you guys, and I can fully attest and vouch for this book. You will learn a lot, and if you make these some of these recipes like I have, you will be eating very, very well. Very good food, like food that doesn't feel like you're, you know, missing out on anything in life just by eating healthier versions or healthier foods in healthier ways. So thank you for your work and all that you've done in this space. I know it's been your own journey, but you're also just helping a lot of people, which is wonderful.
Thank you both so much. I loved this conversation.
Yeah, so great. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. Check out the show notes for all the links. Go follow Phoebe on Instagram and social media, and definitely check out the book. If anything resonated here, if you've been struggling in this area of your life and you want, you know, some help, some guidance, some support, this book will definitely do that. We will talk to you next time. Go spread some light. Okay, bye.
Thank you so much for listening.
If you enjoyed that, check out right over here for some more fun clips.
Oh, and you're going to want to subscribe.
Bye.